So, day 9, we're going to do a haunted house. I'm Max Harper with Simmetri, and yesterday we did Stop Looking at Me with the creepy eyes that kept following you. We had some skulls and some eyes pulled in from Google TiltBrush and Google Blocks off of Google Poly. Today we're going to build the basics of a haunted house, and this one is called Trapdoors and Booby Traps. And we're going to be using these pink triggers. These are spatial triggers, which are going to allow us to fly into these locations in VR and trigger some Lua script, some code that's going to create something interactive. And I've set up 3 of them here. I think we'll be able to get through all 3 of them today. And yeah, so we're going to be using these spatial triggers to set up an environment that kind of just like a haunted house reacts to where you are positionally. So I'm going to give you a little demonstration of how this is working, and then we'll build it. First, we'll go and get these assets. We've put the assets on the in the Discord channel, 30 Days of Simmetri, in the Simmetri Discord channel. You can see the link to the Discord, the invite, in both the chat window during the live stream as well as in the comments of the video. So you'll find the assets there, and we'll also be posting links to them later on. They're all free and remixable. We'll be using a lot of stuff almost exclusively from an awesome creator called Felix, Stief. And he's made some of his models public and remixable on Google Poly. And then the creepy clown that we're going to be using is by Doron Adler. And yeah, so thank you for putting these in the Creative Commons. Yeah, so what I've got is these. You'll see them, they're pink here during stop time. They're pink in stop or in playtime, but when we go to present mode, or we're in VR mode and go into VR present, these pink triggers is what these are called. These pink triggers are going to disappear. They won't be viewable. We won't be able to see them, but we will be able to interact with them basically when we cross their plane, when we enter them or exit them. We can call a script, and we have done this several times now in our 30 Days of Simmetri lessons. In fact, the very first lesson of all teaches you how to do this with a sphere that rolls into these triggers. But this time we're going to be using the VRRig, passing in and out of these triggers, and we'll kind of be able to set up kind of this spatial reactivity. So I won't tell you what each of these do until we see it. And so what I'm going to do is go into VR present mode. I'm selecting the VR viewport. You can see I've got the VR headset on my forehead right now. I'm going to put it over my face, and I'm seeing a 2D screen. And then when I hit the VR present mode, I will immerse into this world. And basically the world is pretty simple in front of me. I can fly, but I'm not using any lasers on the controls, so they're not out in the space. If I kind of fly backwards and look behind me, I can see that there's really nothing in there. So it kind of invites me over into the lit space here. You can take a look at this house. Obviously, it's been made in TiltBrush, so it's sort of just the semblance of a house, and some cool architectural features. Love how sketched out it is, but yet kind of shine some light on it. It gets very volumetric. And so this is kind of a little haunted space. Maybe going through the front door is a little terrifying, so I'm going to sneak around the side. And creepy clown snaps up, bounces into place. It's got light on it, and has a little animated animation on it, and then it's got this audio there, casting this big shadow up against the side. What about this little space? This is kind of a cool space. This little, I don't know what you call this, a cupola, here in this peak If I go into here, what happens? I've been teleported to kind of a starry, moonlit landscape. Another landscape by Felix Stief. This one's got a deer in it. This one's not nearly as creepy, so this is kind of like I've just entered a memory or something, or I've entered like a little dream. Let's walk over to the deer here. And I just went through the deer, and I'm back above my creepy clown. I just flew through the cupola. So that's a teleport, the ability to kind of move between spaces and give your VR audience, your VR participant, a kind of a cool way to like move through various worlds. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. This one is the more sophisticated one. This is the last thing we'll be learning, which is this teleport from space to space. But an easy way to kind of get something similar to that is what I'm going to teach you here, which is this. We're going to go through this door, and it's actually kind of dark, so you'll really just see black. And if I go through it one way, you can see that, yes, I'm indeed on the backside, but if I go through it the other way, I'm now kind of in this hellscape with these skeletons, and I can't seem to get back to my quaint little house. And there you go. Maybe that trigger still exists if I know how to find it. But anyway, yeah. So the use of these spatial triggers can create kind of a cool interactive world. And so let me jump away from this. Let me get away from that viewport because it's shaking around with the VR headset. Let me check out my monitors here. My external monitor seems to be a bit testy. So, how are we going to build this? Yesterday we learned, and I'll refer you back there. Yesterday we learned how to import from Google Blocks, and let me pull all my stuff aside here. I don't know why my monitor froze. We learned how to bring in from Google TiltBrush and Google Blocks, so you'll follow those links. You'll follow the links in the video. Basically, they're going to be Deer Moon by Felix Stief. Let's click on Felix because we're working with a lot of his things. House Sketch by Felix Stief, Stief. Really simple house sketch, and his is in this kind of white and black, but it turned out really nice to just splash a little light on it. What else did he give us? So we did the Deer Moon, the house sketch. He's also got some demonscape or something. I mean, honestly, feel free to use whatever, but we're also using Nito, Nito by him, and that was the last one. We don't treat all these animated textures in Simmetri, but we can recreate them. Yeah, he's got this kind of Grim Reaper scene, and so this was the last one that we were in, so we used this. And then Creepy Clown is by Doron Adler, and it's actually, this is one where you actually really have to manipulate this model, and I'm going to show you how to do that. The data here is kind of the challenge. So let's go ahead and get these if if you're following along. How do you do it? If it's an object like the Creepy Clown, you can download it straight away. And I used, in this case, the GLTF file. And then in TiltBrush, the way you do it is inside of TiltBrush, you have to have liked. Make sure you're using the same account that you have set up with TiltBrush. You need to create a poly account. And then when you go to the Felix Stief items, you need to like it. So you're gonna like the ones that you want to do, and then when you open up TiltBrush, under the sketchbook menu, you're gonna see an option for looking at the ones you liked. Load them up, and if they are if they're public and remixable, you're just agreeing to the Creative Commons. Load them up in TiltBrush, and then once they're open, you're going to go down to the main menu where the sketchbook is and go to the three dots, the more options. Click on that. Then you're going to click on the test tube looking thing. It's I think it's a flask, an Erlenmeyer flask. You're going to click on the flask, which is labs, and then that'll pop up a new little window, and then on that you're going to click export. So it's more options, labs, export is how you're going to take these remixable ones, and then it's going to save to your documents. It's going to save to documents, TiltBrush. I'll show you here. Come here. It's going to save to documents, TiltBrush, exports. And so you can see the ones that I've got here: Nito, Deer Moon, exactly, house sketch. Cool. So in Simmetri, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna create a new project, and we'll probably come back to this one maybe, but we'll create a new project entirely, and we're going for kind of a creepy, haunted world in full blackness. And so for the one with the house, what I decided to use was not a terrain space, but an open space. We used this when we went to the moon on Saturday, a couple days ago. To the moon, we used an open space. So what is an open space? Well, terrain space has the ground. Gravity is naturally set to negative 9.806. And there's a horizon, which is your sky space. And if you click on the sky space, there's all of these controls. That is a terrain space, and it's got terrain that you can manipulate, right? Okay, so it's got your terrain. But an open space is just rendered, is basically a dark atmosphere. It's like outer space. It's a dark atmosphere. It's got physics are working, but gravity is neutralized, so there is no negative. You could make it if you wanted, but by default, gravity's not active. Well, it's not negative in any particular direction, but there is kind of a physics are running, and there's a little bit of like things will eventually slow down. There's kind of like the equivalent of wind air friction or something. Anyway, so we've got this open space, and this is where we're going to import. Let's start with the house sketch, which will give us kind of our first contextual background. So you recall that the Felix Stief house sketch is TiltBrush, so we're going to go to File, Import from Google TiltBrush, and then we're going Documents, TiltBrush, Exports, and I'm going to go to House Sketch, and I'm going to hit Open. And I'm going to bring in House Sketch, select the .fbx, which is interesting too, because if you think that Simmetri is hiccuped on occasion with 3D models, Microsoft inherently doesn't really even know how to read those materials. You will find that dealing with 3D models will cause you moments of friction and maybe grief, but you can see that this little preview just renders all white, but we are working our hardest and doing our best to get, handle these so that you should not have to worry. So House Sketch is going to come in. Don't worry about what it looks like in the Windows preview. Hit Open. We're going to have bring it right in, and so you can see that it's we need to do a little bit of treatment to kind of the environment here, and meaning we probably need to put like a light in the foreground. That's one of my first instincts, and then sort of do some stuff to the background to get it to blend with this model. Another thing that you can always do too is you can always delete chunks when you double click on any model. You can like you'll see that it comes into this a different set of tools, and you can actually like delete away. I'm not going to do it right now, but you could delete this down to just this structure. Like you could leave just the little structure here instead of this background, because clearly Felix drew it in a way where it's meant to kind of be presented from this direction, and it's kind of got like a backdrop. It's kind of like a mobile, you know, it's definitely not meant to be presented from here. He just made these huge swipes for a background, which are pretty cool. But you may or may not want them, and so we'll see if we can live with them and move our get everything kind of set up how we want it. So the first thing I'm going to do is tinker with. The way that you're editing the mesh, excuse me, is you're double clicking on the model, and then you need to double click somewhere away from it, like off the model, and then you're out of the mesh editing mode. Yeah, so let's work our coloring, our lighting here. So we just have a general directional light in an open space, and you can even change its color. So we're going to be changing the color of the light and the amount and color of ambient light. And we're going to be adding a light to the foreground. Let's first start by adding the light, and that way we know kind of what we're up against. Now this might be like a street light. This looks super cool once you add it, and you get this, I don't know, it's just the combination of this being kind of like a sketch, a storybook. It's got this, yeah, it's got this really interesting kind of storybook look. Oops, I'm editing again. Keep double clicking. Once you get this is something to pay attention to when you're working with like big landscape kind of meshes. You're like flying inside of them, and you can tend to grab them. Like when you're trying to select something, you don't select them because Simmetri selects this like the foreground. It selects the big mesh that's around you. I'll call this house scene. What you can do to make sure that doesn't happen is lock. You can lock. You right click in the hierarchy and hit lock, and now it's grayed out. And what that means is I can't select it, which makes it really helpful when you're kind of working inside of the scene. And yeah, so I've got this light in the scene, and now what I want to do, just put it in a place where I kind of like the amount of light and the direction. And then I'm going to work with the directional light in the space. So I'm going to click out here in the black, and I'm going to go to the so I'm going to use the ambient light. And I'm going to take the ambient light and basically knock it down to black, which kind of means that there's no ambient light really bouncing around in the space. And what I get is this much more, I get the house is kind of basically silhouetted, and there's really kind of, if I look backwards, it's pure black in this world. A couple of the things that we can mess with, which might add a little more creepiness, is see what happens if you add more haze. You can kind of dim out the environment, and fog, of course. You could add fog could be helpful here. First, click up the density of the fog. I mean, fog does take a little bit of compute power, but maybe you do want some fog. It will brighten up the space, so you will start to see some of this. You'll see a bit more ambience, which could be cool. And maybe this light isn't pure white. Maybe our foreground spotlight is more like light blue, or maybe it's a dark blue, maybe it's kind of a dim blue. I think this is what I had done, something like this. So before I get too tuned in on this light, let's take a look at what our scale is. You can see that I've pressed G and I've got this little grid helper here. What happens if I press H and get the human scale? Well, there you go. Turns out we've been working on this at a scale that's not quite big enough. So what we need to do is unlock our house scene. We're going to press unlock. And now we're gonna scale up this house scene, and scale it up until it looks like this door. You're gonna scale it up. I'm switching between move, rotate, and scale using W, E, and R. Move, rotate, E, scale, R. W to move. I'm pulling it down until their feet get revealed, so that like the doorway is at kind of the ground plane right there. And then I need to move the light into a new position now. Okay, so this is looking about the right scale. Make it a little bit bigger. Getting it kind of positioned, and then get this light. See, now our light is much less effective. I mean, it has to go much farther and cover more ground. So let's crank up its intensity. Actually, let's do the area radius a little bit. Crank up the intensity just a touch. Not bad. This could work. Let's also take a look at under spot. You can see this hardness value. Maybe we soften it a little bit. And right now, we've also got fairly hard shadows against here. Not that hard. Actually, they're fairly soft, but I'm not sure if we can change that under ambient light. Shadow distance. No, that's for the ambient light itself. Or the directional lamp. So this looks good. This is going to be pretty doable. It seems to be kind of tilted. It seems like it was drawn or saved kind of tilted. And so we can, you know, the last thing you might do on the house scene is tilt it into something maybe a little better. But to be honest, a tilted house might be exactly what you want for hauntedness. So let's work with it here. And we're going to press right click and we're going to hit lock on it just for the moment, so while we build. So we're going to build some VR. The first one we're going to do is this trigger that triggered. We used the clown. So we're going to trigger the clown into action. And how do we do that? Well, we're going to use a timeline, and this is really cool for any kind of narrative story or just triggering a simple animation. And this will be the basis of setting up, you know, what you can do for all kinds of different experience types. And so what we need to do is import the clown. So this one we're going to use. This was from Google Blocks, so we need to use import optimized, or it wasn't a TiltBrush file, so we'll use import from TiltBrush when it's TiltBrush, and everything else, for the most part, we're going import from import optimized, excuse me. So that one's in a zip folder right now, and it is called Creepy Clown by Doron Adler. So this file, just a warning, this file has, the data is pretty weird. I had to tinker with it for a moment, but the first thing I did, I could tell that it was rotating really strangely, and I could not find its like center. You're looking at it, you think it's empty, and it's actually just terribly tiny. It's like you can actually kind of almost see this little dot down there if you zoom in. So I realized, like, look at this thing. That's the clown's head down there. It's like a pebble. So we need to scale this thing up, and so let's scale this thing up. So what we're going to do is actually not use its transform scale. We're going to use what we did like yesterday, and we're going to go using a mesh modifier. But first, let's just name it clown. It's always always good to keep the names on things. So selecting clown, we're going to come to mesh modifiers, and we're going to add a vertex transform, and this is going to transform all the vertices, and we're going to scale them up quite a bit. I think 1000 gets you pretty close to a good range. You can see it growing into existence there. Yeah, so this is, depending on how large you want it to be, yeah, you'll need it to be 1000 gets it to about this size, depending on how big your building is. But I mean, you've got, you know, you can pull the look at it against the human scale. This, I think this guy's 2 meters or about 6 feet. So yeah, so a huge creepy clown face, that should be just fine. Okay, so the other thing that I thought I wanted was kind of this jack-in-the-box effect where it sprung forward, pivoting at the neck. And if the pivot of this model is in its center, like the along this axis instead of on like the bottom of the neck, it'll just kind of rotate like it's nodding yes and no, but I kind of wanted it to like snap forward like it was rising from the dead. And so what I needed to do was get it to be really, to get it pivoting around a point at the bottom of its neck. And so there's two ways I can do that, but one of the easiest ways is with this mesh modifier, with another mesh modifier. So the vertex transform that we used scaled all its vertices out, you know, by 1000. Okay, so then an additional mesh modifier, we're going to do align pivot. And align pivot defaults to aligning that pivot point, its geometric center, to the center with respect to its farthest x, farthest z, and farthest y dimensions. Kind of its, what we'd call its extents, or its boundary box. Yeah. So it goes to it takes all the data, kind of goes, oh, what's the minimum, what's the maximum, etc. And then it gathers all that data basically, and finds the geometric centroid of all those. And so when you put the align pivot on, it goes center, center, center on the x and the y and the z. Well, if I want it to pivot around the bottom of its y, so that right at its neck, so it can snap up, I need to go to the y-axis, set it to minimum. And you'll notice that it moved the data up, but kept the pivot point in the same place. So if I hold down Control, if I'm on Move and I hold down Control, I'll switch to Rotate, and you see it go yellow. Now I've got this neck that will snap forward, which is great. That's what I want. I want it to kind of spring up. Okay, so we did a vertex transform, got it larger. We did an align pivot and put the Y to minimum, which means we get this thing that can now rotate and snap from its base, which is great. Okay. And what we're going to do is be animating this. We're going to get this into a position where it snaps onto our unsuspecting VR haunted house participant. And so I put it over here. I looked at this model and I was like, okay, what if I didn't want to go in the front door? Here's another place where I can kind of, you know, I'm looking for a piece of geometry that's inviting or, you know, constraining, right? It constrains them left to right. It's not just out in the middle of nowhere. So it's sort of like, and this thing was also a nice little space because you were kind of turning into darkness, and it seemed like a nice place to set a booby trap. And so I'm going to get this thing into position. I'm actually going to rotate it until it's completely under. So I'm just going to leave it visible. It'll just be visible underneath here, which means if you flew down here, you'd see the booby trap set into place. And then I'm going to snap it forward just to test to see how it springs into place. I realize that if somebody's walked into here, that thing is going to spring into, it's going to be too close. It's going to like spring onto them. And so I kind of want it to spring into place over here, and maybe like it's positioned like this. And you'll notice that I'm positioning, I'll toggle between L and W. we've got some other tutorials that are teaching the difference, but you see a transform frame is local or world, and it's kind of key to know, because if I'm in the world, I'm using L to transform. If I'm in world, I might this character might not. It's going to rotate along the axis of the world, but if I press it to local, it's going to rotate along its own axis, which means that if I want to rotate this head, like to snap its head forward, no matter what diagonal I put it on or how I orient it in space, if I press L and make it local, it'll always rotate around its own axes, which means that it'll always rotate like around from like its axis of like ear to ear, from nose to the back of its head. And that kind of hinge around the base. So knowing when you might want world or local rotation is key. And there's some other tutorials online for how to toggle between those. So what I need to do is get a light on this thing. So I'm going to place a light. It defaults pointing down. This is a spotlight. I'm going to rotate it up onto my character. And I'm going to just basically assume that if I leave my clown here and I leave my spotlight here, that when it snaps into place, this will be the light that's on it. And a creepier color of light is probably like something slightly green, even a little creepier. Great, so now all I really need to do is get my clown to rotate on time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to basically use a timeline animation to make this thing snap into place, to have this clown snap into place, and we're also going to bring in that sound, let's go snag the sound once we get the timeline in place. So we're not going to use, because when we're not going to use this normal timeline that's running. So like when the person plays in VR and they're flying around and cruising through the space, this timeline is going to be running, and it could be 10 minutes before they come through the trigger. So we want a different timeline for where the animation of this thing exists, and then we basically want the timeline to be animated, and then we're gonna, like, when we hit the trigger, that's gonna activate that timeline, and everything's gonna happen. The light is gonna turn on, this guy's gonna snap into place, and the audio is gonna happen. So the way to do that is creating a new timeline. So we'll right click up in our library, and then we're gonna click timeline, and then new timeline. And let's go ahead and name this timeline, because we want to keep track of it. We're going to call this clown timeline. And so now, if we double left click, we'll open up clown timeline here. And this is the timeline we want to animate on. And we're going to animate the light active property, the rotation of our clown, and the soundtrack will land on here too. So the first one we can do is, we'll come back to Spotlight. We'll start with the rotation. And so if we look at the transform of this guy, the rotation that we want to have activated is this X one right now. So if we basically want to go from like here to here, and we also want it to kind of spring, and that'll be handled in the interpolation. So we want to go from 110 to like 7 or 0 basically. Okay, so we're going to go from positive 110 in the X to 0. And so the way that works is we're selected on the clown, we're under transform, we come down to the X, the thing that we've been rotating. Go ahead and rotate it to the first position that you want, and then follow its line along and come out to this little triangle, and you're going to left click, and then hit new key track. And it now puts onto the clown timeline an X key track. And we're going to double click to create a keyframe, and kind of click it and drag it to 0. So that's going to be our first keyframe. Then we're going to say in the course of like 2.5 seconds, we're going to move the timeline by selecting in this little line right here, this little space right here. We're going to move the playhead to about 2.5 seconds, 1, 2, 2.5. And then we're going to rotate the X back to 0. So the clown gets to the upright position. Then we're going to double click in the space. And you can see what this is, the effect of this. If I press play, it snaps into place. But we don't want it to like jump immediately, so we need to interpolate. So we're going to right click, and we could do linear, but that's okay, that's one way to interpolate here. We could do smooth. Not too much different than linear. Quintic in. Maybe that's a certain type of creepy, but I know that elastic ease in, it's going to overshoot. It like, you see how it bounces over. It overshoots the value. And if I can grab the little keyframe and slide it to the side. And I'm going to get, I think 1.5 is pretty good. It's like pretty snappy. It's very like Jack in the Box style, so I like that. So I did 1.5 and I used elastic ease in. So that's what we want. And if that's the case, you know, we could just start like that. But right now, one of the things that we don't really like is that this light is on. So we need to animate that light's active properties. Also, that guy's chin is still available. Maybe we need to bring him down a little bit more. And you saw what I did. I basically went to the timeline and I right-clicked on that first keyframe, and I can use this little scroll bar to kind of tune it into. You can see his chin was sticking out. And when we get this light off, like, you probably won't be able to see his chin, but might as well like have it underneath. Then, since I changed it, I should see if I like the way that it snaps into place still. And maybe I want it to be a little slower. Cool. So, there you go. So that's a little bit about interpolation and setting the keyframes. Obviously, this is all spelled out, or not all of it, but most of it basically is spelled out under keyframing with the timeline under the Learn tutorial number 11. So we're basically doing that, except this time we're gonna run this, you know, timeline from script. So here we go, boom, boom, boom. He snaps into place, boing. And now we want to turn this light on. So I'm gonna go back into stop time. And so the light, I'm gonna basically come to its active property. I'm gonna turn its active property off, and then I'm gonna come across its active and do a new key track for this one. So that's the light, and then basically like right sometime in here, I'm gonna want to turn it to true, but it also needs to. It's gonna inherit that first frame, so I'm gonna need to create a false. So I double clicked, I created a false that's like right off the bat, and then a few, you know, milliseconds in, I'm gonna go to true, and so it's, you know, it snaps. You could also, you know, ramp up its intensity or area radius or whatever if you wanted it to come up slowly, but snapping into place is just fine for this purpose. Perfect. And so the last thing we want to do on this timeline is make it cackle. And so what I did is I actually just went, to under edit, find freesound.org is a great little place to find various sounds. Not everything's up there, but a lot of royalty-free sounds are up here. And I went to cackle. I just typed to cackle, and yeah, it brought up. This is probably the one, the Baron. Yeah, this one. Sounded good. It had reverb. I liked it, so I downloaded it. And then what I'm going to do, you know, to put the sound in the space, we could do that, and then set its autoplay on timeline, and it would place itself on this timeline when that's set. What we're going to do is add new import background music track, and I'm going to, where I saved it, the clip that I just described, it's called the Baron Cackle.lav. And so I just grabbed that, and now I've got the full set of the booby trap. I've got the light turning on, I've got the audio playing, and I've got the rotation elastically snapping up. And I like it, but I need to make it, you know, just like a mouse trap. I need to kind of set it, right? And so the way that I'm going to do that is clicking on, if I click on Clown Timeline, that takes me back up to the properties of Clown Timeline. As well, I can always find it in my open space here. Come back to Clown Timeline. And I'm going to set its active to false. Okay? So that means that when I play the open space timeline, this is the timeline of my space, that it's running. And the clown timeline is just waiting there. It's waiting for that. It's waiting for that to happen. Its activation, which is cool. So all I need to do is write a little script that can sense when my VR character has entered into this this space right here. So what we're going to be using to call this script is this trigger, and we're going to use a box, and we'll draw the box. We'll draw a box and then kind of shuttle it into place. So a little refrigerator-sized box, and you can always reshape it after you've drawn it. And I'm going to, kind of make it fairly generous, but I want to cover this whole. I'm trying to cover this whole zone here, so there's no way to really get past it without tripping it. And so what I need to do is kind of scale this. So I could use scale and keep kind of scaling it. That would be fine. I also can come up to its shape and change its dimensions there too. So you've got a variety of options. What I want to make sure is that it's high enough, because I'm actually gonna use the VR. Like the thing that's gonna trip it is actually gonna be our HMD, meaning like our head has to go through it for it to get triggered. But see, you can now kind of look at it around and see that it's pretty much filling the space really nicely, which is great. So now what we're going to do is create our VRRig. And in this one, what we're going to do is click on VR, and we're going to use a VRRig blank, and we'll put them in the space. And we're going to place them, we're going to pull the whole rig out away from the house. So they have to approach the house. I don't want them, and then I want to make them face the house. Yeah, so I'm going to pull them out and rotate them so that the this little tetrahedron, this sort of pyramid, the frustrum of this camera is pointing that way. So it's going to face the house to begin with. It's going to be pulled out from the house. And then what I need to do for the VR so that it can people can fly is I'm going to put the press to fly interaction, that I'm going to put that capability on the VRRig's left hand index trigger. You can place it however you want. It's totally up to you. And I'm going to just place it on the index trigger. So that means there's no lasers and there's no other interactions except I can just sort of move around the space. And now when I press VR, I can fly over and go through this trigger. So everything is pretty much set except we need two more things. One, the trigger needs to understand that the HMD camera or the VRRig or something on this VRRig has to trip its sensors. And by tripping its sensors, that means what we're calling trigger activating. And I'll show you that if you draw an object in space, we have an attribute on them that's default to trigger activating. It means that it's actually going to activate that trigger when it goes through. Another term might be trigger tripping, like it will trip the trigger. But the HMD, the VRRig, or the camera that is the VRRig, like the head position of your VR participant, they don't have this trigger activating on them. So if you flew into this trigger, you wouldn't trip it. You'd be invisible to the trigger, which is great in a lot of the cases. It's really important that that's the case. But if you do want the trigger to work, you need to add it. So you'll select, and I'm going to put it on the camera. So if when the camera travels anywhere through this pink box, I want it to trip trip the trigger. So I'm going to select the HMD camera. I can select it right here, HMD camera, and I'm going to come up to this little triangle with the Add Attribute button here, and I'm going to add Trigger Activating. Which means now that I go through the trigger, I will activate that trigger. Okay, so now we just need to change the trigger code to do something, and it really just needs to do one simple thing, which is activate our mousetrap here, our little timeline that's inactive, this clown timeline. So let's we can get into the trigger code any way. You can click it into space, click it over here, and right click, edit on enter code. If you've selected the trigger, you can click here and hit edit on enter code. You can come over to on enter. So we will right click it to hit on enter. And so that's when you travel from the outside to the inside of the box. There's also on exit when you travel from the inside of the box to the outside. But when we go from outside to inside, we're going to enter. And the thing that enters is OBJ, just as a reminder. It gets this variable name. So when our HMD comes through, the HMD object is now going to be accessible by OBJ. So all we need to do is bring the timeline into this trigger. So I can click on the clown timeline to bring the timeline back up, and now I can get a hold of its icon right here and drag it into our triggers on enter. And it's as simple as basically now working with this variable and saying, you know what, turn on the active property clown timeline dot active equals true, and you can see that it's false at the beginning of the show, and then through this script we're going to turn it to true. So let's see if that works. I'm going to go into VR mode, and VR is working. You can see the headset is tracking. And I'm going to go into VR present. So I need to turn on my handsets. Alright, so when my head crosses into this box, it should work. Or ooh, not bad. I like it. Having experienced it, however, though, I think my creepy clown needs to come up a little bit. And so I'll set that in motion. So that's great. That worked. It knew that the HMD was trigger activating and set the timeline into action. So perfect. We've basically basically accomplished our first mission. I'm going to activate that. And I'm going to move this into a new place. Then I'm going to hit Control T, which is going to commit that position. And then I'm going to hit stop. And then my clown timeline needs to be deactivated again. Look at that one more time through VR. And I've also can set you up to see new screen display for the HMD, which means that you'll now see it monoscopically instead of my right eye, left eye. So we should have a better clown, scarier clown. Yeah, that's perfect. It could be a little higher, but I like where it is. I can bring up the clown a little bit. Clown. So we've got our first booby trap, which is pretty cool. Very functioning. I'm going to save here. Save this as Dana and mid-lesson. Very cool. So the next challenge for us is to do a little bit of logic. So I had set this one up to basically be a portal. The other to like reveal a space. And I like this idea. You know, it didn't quite work in my opinion in this house the way that I wanted it. The way that I wanted it to work was like if you went into a house, when you came back out, the world had changed. And so maybe a different model would afford you that. But that's the idea, that if you go in the door and come back out the door, you would be in a different place. And so let's set that up now. What I'm going to do to maybe improve it just a little bit is bring a little bit more light into this scene. The door was basically pitch black, which I think was kind of an issue. If I dim down this light just a little bit, I think the area radius is good. Oops. Keep it where it can cast shadows, but just dim it. And then spot. Good. So I want to get 2 of these, because on the backside it was black, and I thought that was kind of like one of the things that wasn't helping it much. Yes. And Felix Stief has done tremendous work. Again, though, it's not like, it's kind of meant to be viewed from one vantage point, one position. Maybe this light is not quite enough. Let's delete this one. Yeah, there's not enough on the background to really get the view. So, okay, so in our next little piece of the lesson, what we're going to do is go in, and only once we've gone in and then back out will the script work. So we're going to add a little bit of logic. I'm going to leave us just a little guidepost. So I'm going to draw a little kind of glowing post and see if this helps me orient my way once I'm through it. And trying to come back. Yeah, there's just not much light back here. Yeah, it's almost. Just dim it out. There. That should be enough. I'll delete my guidepost. Yep. As long as there's kind of light that says maybe go through here. Just trying to make like a noticeable kind of portal. And so that's the goal. because they won't see the pink. Remember, they just sort of see the actual geometry, and so it's nice to kind of illuminate it to tell them maybe you could go here or not. Maybe it's darkness with where you want it all to happen, and that's fine too. But for you to be able to see it, I think it's good. Okay, so I'm going to put a little trigger in here. Put a plane. We're going to use a plane trigger. And I'm going to rotate it, kind of get it into alignment with our door. Rotate it up. Come over to this side and rotate it up. Holding down Shift, I'll get 45-degree snapping. Come back into this view. Might resize it. I'm actually going to make it a little bigger. I'm going to scale it. Kind of make it a little bit bigger than the door, be a little bit generous. And you can see that the arrows are pointing kind of back against the direction that I would come. So I'm actually I'm gonna rotate that, because the arrows, that means enter. And so I kind of want enter to be the first way. So we enter the house going that direction. And so then I'll rotate it and then kind of drag it into place so that it lives kind of right here at this, right in this sort of threshold. Cool. Very cool. Okay, so it's going to live here. It's going to live right here on the door. And now its code is going, what it's going to do is basically activate or deactivate a certain layer of like a mesh or a part of the world. And so what I was doing was basically, as you crossed through that plane and you expected to look back at something, basically that it would be the way that it was when you came in, that it's going to be something else now. And so what we need to do is import that something else. And so we're going to go to import from Google TiltBrush. I'm going to bring in those skulls, which were under the title Nito. And we'll grab the FBX. We'll hit open. And it just got everything dark, so it must be a very large model. Moving it around. I'm going to clone this light over to the and rotate it onto our model to shed some light on the matter. This is a pretty dim light, intentionally. Wow, okay. And then, obviously, the creepy angle, one of the creepy angles for light is from beneath. I'm going to name this piece of mesh, this little world. I'm going to call this skull scene. And I can actually attach the light to it so that as I move it into place, it comes with this light, brings the light with it. And so I just need to get to a vantage point where I'm going to bring these two. So when I come out the door, let's come out this door, I'm going to be looking directly at this. So let's say I come out this door. I want this scene to be right in front of me. There you go. So I might want a little less fog in this scene. It seems like there's quite a bit of fog. might make it a little clearer when they come out. Okay, cool. So, yeah, just bringing some other, scene into place. And what you're going to do is basically, I've put the light with it, and now if I were to turn this one, if I were to take this object now, the skull scene with the light underneath it, and set its active property to false, I no longer am seeing it. And then if I were to do the same for our house scene, I'm going to have to unlock it. When I click on the house scene, if I were to turn it off, I wouldn't see anything except, this clown. And if I also turn the clown off, I would no longer see it. So we can do that in a script very easily. And so all we need to do is toggle which one's active and which one's false. And so we'll do that on this trigger. So the idea was that we have to go through the house first and then exit the house. Now, you could just say, okay, yeah, I can get in through the house, and if I exit it, then make the skull scene active, make the house scene and the clown inactive. And that's totally viable if you want to make it work that way. We're going to use just a little bit more script to make it work, where only if you've entered the house, then re-exited the house, does this magic effect take place, this little transport kind of. So the way that we're going to do that is click on our trigger, this second trigger, and I'll go ahead and call this something. I'll call this house to skull trigger. House to skull trigger. And so if I right click on house to skull trigger, I can edit its on enter code. And we're going to use an on enter event and an on exit event. So if you come to the trigger, under its on the trigger, it has events. We want an on enter, which we have, and then we'll click on exit, so we have an exit. And we basically need to store, we're going to need to basically say, okay, I've been entered once, and now I'm getting exited. And if I get exited without being entered, nothing should happen. And so we're going to set up a little series of tests here that kind of test for an overall state. And we're going to write our own custom function called test. So basically what happens is if we've been entered, we want to log that we've been entered. And if we exit, we want to log that we've been exited. And so I need to set up a variable to store my enter, whether enter has entered is true or not, and if I've exited is true or not. So basically, we need to use what's called the onInitialization code. And I'm actually going to, I should have put this one at the top. You want this to come at the top, and you're going to say onInitialization, and I will say self dot have been entered. And I'm going to say it equals false. So I have not been entered yet. But once I've been entered here, trigger, I can now say, if I've been entered, change that variable to self dot have been entered. Make it true. And when I come through the exit, now I just need to test for if self dot have been entered and you need 2 equal signs to test in a conditional. Say if self.haveBeenEntered equals true, then, oh, excuse me, my then needs to be over here. And I need to have an end for this statement. If I've gone through this and I'm coming back, now when I'm exiting, if that's true, let's do something. What we want to do is make our skull scene dot active true. So we'll drag in from the icon, skull scene, and we'll say skull scene dot active equals true, and then I'll make that visible. Then I want the clown. I'm just making these enters. I'm just doing that for visual sake. It doesn't matter. I'm going to say clown.active equals false. And I want the house scene to be false. Let's give this a shot. So if I fly, let's just make sure we're, let's see if this throws an error. So this is the case where I exit the door, but have not entered it. But if I enter it and then exit it, now I'm in a new space. Got this essentially in a new space, the appearance of a new space, which is pretty cool. And everything else has like disappeared. And in this case, I haven't really delivered us any way to get back. But you could imagine using any of the things we've learned up to this point, to interact with this space, potentially to get me back to the other space. I could interact with it. Maybe I have to pass a test or something. So very cool. So those are two ways of kind of setting up spatial triggers. They're all working off of the fact that this VRRig's HMD has a trigger activating on it, and then it's doing something interesting. In this case, it's activating a timeline, which has, the Jack-in-the-Box scenario, and in this one, it's got a little bit more logic, which encourages, us to go through it in a certain way. And yeah, so you could get a lot done with those. We're gonna save for tomorrow the transfer from space to space, because this is enough to work on for today. And what we're gonna do in the next one is where you can transfer from this space as a VR person back to like the terrain space, and you can move from this space into another space. And you saw us go into the deer, but I'm gonna stop the lesson for today here. And in the demo we went from here into the deer space, and we'll pick up there tomorrow. The last thing I'm going to show you is just, let's imagine that you came in and when you built this, you want them to be able to pick things up and whatnot. So you may have like on your VRRig, you wanted to like add a laser to your left hand. And then you have things that are pressed, to be grabbable. Some of those items will be trigger activating, and if you have other trigger activating objects in this space, you may want to have this trigger be a little bit more robust, a little bit more particular. And what I mean is that, let's say some other object in here is trigger activating that you want to be trigger activating, but you only want this trigger in this space to do something when the HMD camera comes through, right? So when the HMD with its trigger activating attribute on it triggers this, then I'm going to run this script, and I might want to run it really particularly, very differently when the HMD comes through. Maybe something happens, maybe it just plays as a little sound if like little objects fly through it that are trigger activating, but as soon as you go through it, it does something else. So what would that mean? Basically, when I come through and I'm the VR person wearing this HMD and I'm trigger activating, when I come through this trigger, the trigger runs this function, runs its onEnter function, and it passes in the OBJ. OBJ is the HMD in this case. It's the HMD camera. But if a ball flew through it that was also trigger activating, it would be the ball object, and OBJ would be referencing the ball. So what if I just want to test for if it's actually the HMD and not something else? So in that case, what I will do is basically just say if obj colon get name, and I'm going to get the name, and that's lowercase g uppercase n, and oops, excuse me, if obj colon get name, and that's going to return the name of the OBJ. So when the HMD camera comes through it, it's going to return this name, this the string HMD camera. So if obj colon get name says our trigger, if the name is equals, if it equals HMD space, excuse me, this has to be in quotes, HMD space uppercase C camera, close quote. If it equals HMD camera, then activate the clown, get the clown timeline, and then set its active to true, and then we have to end our if statement. So there you go. So this'll work the same way, except if you had some other thing in the space that could activate the triggers, it won't trip until the HMD goes through. So it's sort of like if this is a mouse, snap, but if it's a cat, don't snap it. Would be the way of thinking of a really smart mousetrap. You might also then say, if obj colon get name, equals something else, then do something else in here. So this would be if you had some other particular thing that you want to happen in there. So just, a little idea that once the triggers are in place and you have anything else that is trigger activating, go ahead and run this test. That can be very helpful. And look forward to tomorrow's lesson where we will teleport from space to space. And it'll likely be a pickup right here. And if not, maybe I'll build something even more unique. I'll be interested to see what you create. This whole situation of playing a timeline when you pass through an area, if you extended that through a much larger drawing or much larger like space, you could kind of create a whole fascinating house of horrors and storytell some really interesting things. And then I also like this logic, which you wouldn't even necessarily have to contain to one trigger. So what do I mean by that? Well, on this trigger, you saw what we did. You saw that we said this variable, the have I been entered. Well, that makes sense. Imagine, we enter the door, then we come out of the door. So it tests whether or not that door has been entered. Well, what if we wanted it to work in such a way where it's wait until if you've come around the side, then activate this trigger. If you go through trigger A, then only then is the next trigger active. Are different ways that you can set it, and so one of the ways that you could do that, for example, and I'll leave you with this wonderful logic. Here's one way to do it. I could, for example, set this trigger. Let's say we set our door trigger. Let's set our door trigger to active false, which means that no matter how many times I go through this trigger, it's not going to work until I activate the clown. Go through the clown activating trigger. Once I go through this one, let's activate this one. And so this one starts off false, but when I go through this trigger, let's edit its code. When I go through this trigger on the left, the clown activating one, let's when we trip this trigger, let's set this trigger to active and ready to sense whether I go through it. So when it's inactive, it's no longer sensing. See, so it's inactive, so it's not sensing if anyone goes through it. This one is sensing, and when we edit its code, if the HMD camera comes through, we're going to set the clown timeline to active, and let's do one more thing. Let's go and get our house to skull trigger. Let's go grab that trigger and bring it into our script right here in the if statement, right after we set the clown timeline active. And let's just copy this and paste it down here, and then we're going to say dot active equals true. Which means, again, just repeating myself, which means that I have to basically set this clown off before I can go enter and exit. Which in this case, maybe doesn't set up a very sensible flow, because I'll have to like go through here, then come back around, then go in, then go out. But nevertheless, if the principle I'm trying to teach you is just like be super fun to set up like a whole kind of maze. Basically, it's kind of like the perfect setup for like a maze, where the order in which you activate the space is important. Our skull did not come up. If I set the skull to the active track, is our skull still active? Hold on, our clown. Clown is active. Let's check it out again. I'll have to probably debug that. See where I went wrong. We'll come back and fix that. So now I've activated that timeline, and now once I go in and back out, I'm in the skull world. Let me see what I did with my skull here. Do a little live debugging. And we'll just hit escape at this point and take a look at our clown. Come back to go to this open space viewport. Fly the camera around. We're in pause time. That's what the green is on the edge. The clown should have moved here. Did we overshoot? Oh. It's like snapping. Let's check that out. So, let's do this one more time. And in this case, what I said was, hey, if I come up here and I go in the door and back out the door. Well, I just took a screenshot. Wrong. In the door, out the door. Still not in skull world. Can't get to skull world until I trip this one. And then the logic on this door is that unless I've gone through it, I won't trip it going back out. But if I go through it and then back out, I'm in skull world. Really cool. I love kind of that just simple spatial logic and I feel like haunted houses are a great place to kind of set up that that kind of maze, sort of labyrinth-like other dimension logic. Another thing you might play with, and I'll leave you here, is imagine that instead of just tripping the timeline that has the animation of some object in the space, like a clown, imagine you actually animate the space itself. Imagine that the space that you're in, while you're standing there, all of a sudden does something like this, right? And imagine animating that kind of a situation where you fly in and you trip a thing, and all of a sudden the space rotates on you. It also could shrink on you. It could grow or shrink or stretch in interesting ways. Give all that a shot, and be excited to see what you make. I'm going to share this now onto Steam. I'm going to exit VR mode. I'm going to make a nice screenshot looking, maybe more like up kind of. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File, Share on Steam. I'm going to call this Interactive Art Educational Public Export Settings 30. This one should take a little while. The meshes can sometimes be a significant amount of data. Also, when I'm streaming, competing for bandwidth. Discord. Also, make sure to note that you can always find these, the content. You can find a lot that are featured. You can also go to the hang on. Sometimes Steam gets a little testy. Close Steam VR. Doesn't want to. You can always visit the workshop by hitting Shift Tab. And you can subscribe to any of these by hitting subscribe, and then you will find them. You will find them here. Sorry, you will find them here under subscribed. All right, look forward tomorrow to teleporting your VR from space to space.